Hi, I'm Eddie O'Donnell for Tools for Working Wood. Here in my studio shop, welcome. And today we're going to be talking about shellac. Now, as you can see, I've got a lot of shellac in front of me. And what we're going to cover is a wide range of shellac topics, from the basics all the way to the pinnacle, with a quick introduction to French polishing. Let's talk about shellac in general, the different kinds that are available, and what we're really looking for in our shellac. The first thing to know is that there are two basic types of shellac that you can buy, waxed and de-waxed shellac. Essentially the difference being that in de-waxed shellac, there is no wax content in the finish itself. Sometimes the waxy content can impede the ability for other finishes to stick to that shellac. And that is one of the reasons you want to use de-waxed shellac or shellac in general, because it's able to stick to pretty much any other surface. Because shellac likes to stick to everything, and you can use shellac as an in-between coat for a lot of finishes, or as a bonding coat to get two surfaces that don't necessarily want to bond to each other to bond. So let's say you have a really oily piece of wood that you're worried about your varnish properly sticking to because of all those oils. You can put down a thin coat of shellac to act as a bonding agent for that varnish. If you use the waxed shellac, there's a chance that the varnish won't properly bond, and in some of the areas will begin to peel up because of the wax. On the other hand, de-waxed shellac is able to stick to surfaces in both directions, so to speak. That way, it'll stick to the oily piece of wood, and then on top of that, your varnish will be able to stick and adhere to that shellac. One of the things that makes shellac so useful. So let's talk about one of the uses for shellac in that case, which is using shellac as a conditioner. Essentially, if you have a blotchy piece of wood or a blotchy species of wood, you may want to put a very thin, light coat of shellac down first to allow whatever finish you're going to put on top of that to properly adhere and to adhere evenly across the surface. Obviously, we have the flake shellac up front here, as well as some pre-mixed in a can shellac. So let's talk about some of the attributes of the pre-mixed can shellac. It's convenient. That being said, it doesn't come in many different varieties. There's a couple of different shades in de-waxed and waxed versions, and it might come as part of a paint primer. And that's where it'll shine. Convenience to use as a primer. And overall, that's the kind of use that I see the pre-mixed stuff being good for. The only other thing I'll say about it is that you can get it in an aerosolized form in a rattle can. And I like that version of it because I do think that a sprayed coat of shellac is very, very nice, and that makes it accessible for a lot of people. You should definitely be wearing a respirator, not just a dust mask, when using it though. The next thing we're going to talk about are the flake form shellac, which are definitely the preference for people who prefer a finer finish when it comes to shellac. Not to say that you can't get it out of the can, but you get a lot more control from flakes in a bag. These particular bags are all de-waxed shellacs. Now, as you can see, there's 4 different colors that I've got in front of me and 2 different brands, or 2 different versions of the same brand, I should say specifically. These are all BT&C shellacs, which are the in-house brand at Tools for Working Wood. And you can see that the range in colors is just a spectrum, essentially. The lightest being super blonde, the darkest being garnet. Garnet is what's most natural. As you get lighter, more treatment is done to the flakes to get a clearer color. And you can kind of see what the overall impact of that is like here. The super blonde adds just a little bit of yellow. And the garnet adds quite a bit of oranging. This is amber and this is blonde, and those are in between. Now these two, which are just the standard BT&C shellacs, are very nice traditional Indian shellac flakes, and they only come in garnet and blonde, whereas these two are actually part of a larger line. The tiger flakes are more refined. They actually come from Germany, and they span the full gap. So they also have a blonde and a garnet. And essentially, these other flavors, or all the flavors in general, are part of this spectrum. Amber is a mixture of garnet and blonde. Blonde is not as bleached as the super blonde would be in terms of the process that lightens the color of the shellac. As you can see here, the jumps between grades of shellac are actually pretty subtle. But if you want, you can mix the different flakes together to fine-tune the exact color that you want out of your shellac. And as you can see, for example, with the super blonde, that might be the direction you might want to go as something like an in-between coat. If you're putting that down first, you're going to affect the color of the wood the least, and then you can put a finish on top of that. That might affect the color more in the direction that you want it. So what you get from flake shellac, ultimately, is an immense amount more control. Now, it's a little bit more inconvenient in the sense that you do have to dissolve this stuff yourself. You can't just take a bag, pour some out, and start rubbing it in. So with that, you have to buy something to dissolve that with. Now, all shellac is dissolved in alcohol. And there are a couple of different choices that you get when it comes to that alcohol. Now, you can buy denatured alcohol from the store. That is alcohol and then methanol. Methanol is a poison. Essentially, they've had to add this poison to make it a chemical grade, non-drinkable substance because the main part of it, ethanol, is a drinkable substance and is sold in liquor stores and has to be taxed like a liquor. And that's actually what I suggest you buy because that stuff's 100% natural, 100% ingestible. So you're not having to worry about those toxic fumes, which methanol really does give off. Now, there are some green versions of denatured alcohol, but I find them to not always be as reliable as good old grain alcohol. Most likely the kind of grain alcohol that you're going to find is Everclear. This is the most common brand you're going to see in liquor stores across the United States. That being said, there are definitely some states that do not sell high enough proof grain alcohol or grain alcohol at all. So you have to check your local laws and figure out exactly what the regulations in your state are for getting something like this. In which case, if you are in one of those states, the greener versions of the denatured alcohol, I believe Clean Strip makes a green version of it, are probably the safest way to go. But if you can get grain alcohol, you have to make sure that it's 190 proof. You want as little water content in there as possible and as much alcohol content as possible. Otherwise, the shellac flakes will not dissolve. Now, you don't have to get Everclear. In fact, I often buy other brands because they're a little bit less expensive and you can get them in larger containers. Don't be afraid to go that route. Generally speaking, most of the grain alcohols that are out there are relatively similar. This one is just the most common that I've found. So going back to the differences between the flakes and the premixed stuff, another big pro for the flakes that the premixed stuff loses out on is longevity. Now, they say that these cans roughly have a shelf life of 3 years. But if you're just walking through the store and picking something up, you may pick up a can that's been on the shelf for 2.5 years, and that can's on its way out already. So that's one thing that you have to be very careful of when you're buying canned shellac. With the flake shellac, the longevity is almost indefinite. Flakes in this format, in these bags as they're packaged, come with a deoxygenizer and a desiccant to reduce moisture. As soon as you open the bag, they need to be protected. I've kept these in the bag for show purposes, but generally what you should do is you should pour them out into a jar. Take something like this, for example. Nice big jam jar, or in this case, broth jar, with a tight lid that makes it airtight. Mason jars work well also, because they also have a very nice airtight seal. Once you get it into the jar, throw the jar in the fridge. The colder the shellac flakes stay, the longer life they have. And the way to know when these flakes begin to go off, they'll begin to clump, and when they clump very, very hard and become almost crystalline in nature, and then as you break them apart, they become very dusty, that's when they've esterified. And that esterification process means that essentially that shellac will always be gummy. No matter how much alcohol you dissolve it in, it'll never really go back to being the nice flake shellac in the bag. So I suggest just simply loading them into a couple of jars and throwing them in the back of your fridge. And maybe putting a label on them so that people know what it is when they open the fridge door. All right, so now we have our flake shellac, we have our grain alcohol. What are the things that we need to think about in terms of turning this into a usable finish? So, shellac is measured in what's called a pound cut. The premixed versions are also measured like this, and they don't obviously offer you the control that you get when you have flakes like this. So, essentially, The pound cut is in reference to how many pounds of shellac there are to 1 gallon of alcohol. And it's just a ratio. On the fronts of these bags from BT&C, there is the ratio printed out to give you a basic guide on what the different pound cuts are. And the easiest way to measure your pound cut is to get a little food scale like this. Actually, not like this. This is an old actual manual scale that I have. Most of the time I do this with the digital scale, but I forgot that today. No big deal, we can still do it with this. And essentially, you're going to shrink those ratios down. So I've got a jar to mix this in. I've got a jar of a little bit of alcohol here. And we're just going to weigh this out. So let's tear that. All right, there we go with 0. Let's see, let's make some amber shellac. All right, I've got my little spoon here. Now, once you've measured out shellac a few times, you'll begin to get the hang of it, and you'll be able to do it visually and just kind of, rather than by weight, by volume. But it's important to do this a few times, just to get the understanding of what the ratios look like. So, let's say for this, we want a 1 pound cut. So that'd be 1 pound of flakes to 1 gallon of alcohol. So let's begin to divide that down, because we don't have a gallon of alcohol here, and we don't need a gallon of shellac. So roughly here, I've got about 5 ounces of alcohol, as is measured by the side of this jar. Let's just take 1 ounce and measure that out. There we go. That's about 1 ounce in there. All right, now time to figure out how much alcohol we need relative to that. So 1 pound divided by 16 gives us 1 ounce. So a gallon divided by 16 would be 1 cup. There we go. All right, we've got our shellac in there. Want to give it a shake just to get everything covered, get everything agitated, get everything floating around in there. And this is going to take some time to dissolve. Frankly, it's going to take several hours before it dissolves properly. I like to leave it overnight. That's a pretty convenient way. You know, you do it the night before, leave them overnight to dissolve, and by the time you're ready to do things the next day, it should be ready for you. Now, if you need something faster than that, because that isn't always convenient, there is a different way. There's something called shellac dust, which I have a little bit of right here. And essentially, it's very finely ground shellac. You can put it in a spice grinder, actually. You can do it yourself like that and turn it into a very consistent fine dust. And once it's this fine, it'll take about half an hour before it properly dissolves. Now, one thing you have to be very careful of with this is that if you're not measuring things out, this is much denser than the flakes. The flakes take up a lot more space, and this can get compacted a lot more, kind of the same way they can in baking. But with this stuff, it's really hard to tell, if you're just doing it visually, how much alcohol to add. So it's very important to do this by weight. That's where a really good digital scale that's a lot more sensitive than this one comes into play. So as you can see here, I've got a medley of jars that I've collected for shellac. Now, obviously, you can see that these are some blonder colors of shellac in here. This one's super blonde, and I've just marked them on the tops of the lids here. This one is regular blonde, and we've got amber and garnet. And these are the kinds of jars that I tend to like to work out of. When using shellac, there's going to be a couple of different ways that you can apply it. You can apply it with a rag, you can apply it by brushing, you can apply it by spraying, and then you can apply it by French polishing, sort of the ultimate of all those things. So let's talk a little bit about just using a rag, for example. So I've just got a little sample board here of some walnuts and a group of rags right here. In terms of the pound cuts that I have in here and the importance of those pound cuts is now going to become apparent. The thicker the pound cut, the more shellac that's getting on here, and shellac in its nature is very sticky. So if you put too much on at once, you can end up with a bit of a gummy mess. Essentially, anything more than a 3-pound cut, way too much. I've always been of the mindset that many thin coats are the way to success. And with shellac, that's even more the message that I like to push. So I stick between a 1/2 pound and a 1-pound cut for most things. Every now and then I'll work my way up to a 2-pound cut. And the nice thing about shellac in this form is that if I'm at that 2-pound cut and need a little bit thinner, I'll go back, grab a little alcohol, pour it in. Don't need to be super accurate about it. I can kind of fine tune it as I'm working. And in this case, when you're ragging stuff on, you have a little more license to go a little bit thicker with it. But I think what I've got in the jars are 1-pound cuts. So I'm just going to stick with that. So right here, I might want to put on something like the amber. I think that looks quite nice. Amber or garnet on the walnut. It's quite nice. Now obviously I can't dip this massive pad in here. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll get a dish to pour a little out into. Good use for old Tupperware there. So now I've got a little bit of shellac on my pad here, and we can just wipe this on. And this is a great way to apply a wash coated shellac. You know, if you're using it as a bonder, as an in-between step. Great way to apply a shellac, for example, before you're going to throw some wax over something, which is a very traditional finish. Now, as you can see, very, very thin coat, just enough to affect the color of the wood. But now, because it was a relatively thin coat, a couple more minutes actually, this will be fully dry. If I want to keep adding, I can add a little more right now, just because it's already pretty dry. And the thinner your shellac is, or the lower the pound cut is, the sooner this can happen, because the faster it dries out, because it's the alcohol that's flashing off that's allowing things to dry so quickly. So that's a really simple way to just throw some shellac on a board. And it's very easy, particularly for smaller projects and lighter projects. It's certainly one of the easiest ways to go. Just throw some shellac on there and get it over with. So now that we're done with the pad, let's talk a little bit about brushes. Brushing shellac on is a very traditional way of applying shellac. It leaves really, really nice surface because, again, the shellac doesn't need to go on thick. And it's an easy way to get into more decorative pieces. Anything that has a bit of crenellation to it, or anything that has a bit of carving and design to it. The bristles on the brush are designed to conform to a surface. And it's not just any brush that you should use. A good quality brush goes a long way, particularly with shellac. And in this particular case, I've got one of the brushes from Gramercy Tools. These are the fine finishing brushes for shellac and lacquer. These have particularly fine hairs on them that are natural hairs that are very good at not only conforming to that surface, but also for carrying the correct amount of finish. One of the main problems with synthetic hairs is that they tend to take up too much liquid in the finish and become clumpy and stiff. So we've got a board here with a bit of a defect in it, which would be a good place to show where you can't really use a pad like that for fear of getting stuff caught in there or getting the surface uneven. Is a good place to use something like a brush. One thing I really like to do is before I put the brush in the finish, I'm going to charge it with just a little bit of the solvent. So I've got a little bit of alcohol in here, and I'm just going to dribble a little bit on the brush just to get it started. Now you really don't need much. Just let that wick in there, just a little bit. And so we don't need to saturate the brush in shellac. We're just going to dip the tips in. Just pick up a little bit on both sides. And you can see that the shellac pretty much is existing just on the tip there. We don't need more than that now because we're brushing on. We're not going to pull from an edge. We're going to go from the center out. Lay down nice even coats. As you can see, I've got a nice coat of shellac on there. And even this corner here already is beginning to dry out. That's how thin our shellac is. And that's actually beginning to spider throughout the whole board. Now that I've done that, I've got a shellac-y brush. And you may be thinking, well, how are you going to clean that brush? Well, it's very simple. You don't actually need to clean these brushes. You can let them harden. Because the next time you use the shellac, the alcohol in the shellac will actually redissolve the finish. And this brings up another major point of shellac, is that it's highly repairable. It is always able to be dissolved by alcohol. It makes it bad for some things. I wouldn't necessarily use it on a table that's often going to get a glass of whiskey on it. That being said, in terms of the finishing aspect of it, it makes it very easy to repair. So for example, if a glass of whiskey ended up on a shellacked table, adding a little more shellac to it and having it not leave witness lines or little splotches or inconsistencies would actually be quite easy. This is one of the great reasons to think about using shellac for more things, because it is easily repairable. And though it doesn't stand up great to water, heat, and obviously alcohol, in many situations, it's a lot easier to repair than any other finish that couldn't stand up to one of those things. If I did want to clean this though, and often I don't like to leave too much shellac in my brushes so that they get too stiff, there is an easy way just to get most of the stuff out of there. It won't stop it from getting stiff, but it will make it just a little bit clearer and a little bit easier to reinvigorate the next time you need to use it. So I've got another tray here. I'm just going to take this tray and I'm going to put a little bit of alcohol in there. Don't need a ton. We'll just start with that for now. So what a lot of people do is they'll jam the brush up against some alcohol. They'll work with their fingers to massage all the stuff out of the brush. You don't need to be that vicious with it. And in fact, actually, you'll damage the hairs and begin to tear them out if you do that. You can leave them in a bath of alcohol, but that's inconvenient, and then that alcohol gets murky. So I just go with something very simple. I get some alcohol in it, and I just dab my brush at a slight angle in the bottom, kind of squishing, that's a technical term, all the stuff in the brush out. I'm not pushing particularly hard. I'm not going at a particularly steep angle. Just picking up some alcohol and just squishing it out. And you do this a few times until the alcohol is pretty murky. And once you're done, which we didn't have much in here and it was quite light anyhow, just kind of straighten the bristles out, and with a nice little hole there, you can hang it up. These brushes from Gramercy Tools come in a little paper satchel. You can use those to store them as well. It's actually a very convenient way to protect the brush from other substances getting on them. So either you can cut some pieces of paper yourself, or if you have the one that it came with, just use that. These brushes come in 3 sizes. There's a 1-inch, a 2-inch, and a 3-inch. I find the 1-inch is really good for delicate work, and 2-inch for most panels. Obviously the 3-inch makes sense if you're doing bigger work. In addition to these brushes, I also recommend some artist brushes. If you're doing anything very, very complicated and you need to get into very tight spaces, I like to pick up small artist style brushes, again, trying to stay away from the synthetic hairs. So to get a real finish on here, you're gonna need to put on a decent amount of coats if you're starting at that level. If you wanted to work a little bit heavier than that, 2-pound cut is probably the way to go. Generally speaking, what I like to do is the first application relatively thin, and then the subsequent applications can get thicker and thicker. But the kind of surface you can get from a brushed or ragged on finish can actually be quite nice. And again, you can put on top of that a coat of paste wax and turn that into a really, really nice piece that has a little more protection than just the shellac has to offer. And that's one of the reasons that those are used in combination. So it really comes down to what kind of abuse is the piece going to get. And one of the best things you can do with shellac is if you finish something with shellac and figure it doesn't actually have enough protection, you can put whatever finish you want right on top of it. So now that the piece is pretty much dry, if I built up more coats, it would begin to look a little bit more like our sample board here, which is brushed on. Gets a little bit of that gloss to it. Now you don't have to sand between coats. One of the nice things about shellac is that because it's repairable through the alcohol, just like with the brushes, it'll actually burn in the previous surface of shellac with the new surface of shellac. If I were to apply another layer of shellac on here, it would dissolve the layer that's on there and then bond what I just added to it, to the top of it, and growing one singular layer. And that's one of the reasons that shellac has its particular luster and clarity, and why it's good for things like French polish. Though the shellac burns in the new layer to the previous layer, you don't really need to sand. In order to reduce some of the subtle texture, you may want to sand. And sanding is good. The biggest thing is to make sure that the shellac is fully dry when you do sand. And you just want to hit it lightly. Again, you don't need to do much to the surface to get it ready for a new coat of shellac, because the shellac's going to do most of the work itself. But it is good, particularly on the first few coats, where you may get a little bit of raised grain, to just hit the surface ever so lightly to make sure that none of those inconsistencies continue to read through as you build your surface. So now we're going to move on to probably the hardest thing to do in shellac, French polishing. And this is going to involve a multi-step process. And we're going to start off by talking about this stuff. Now I've got these two cans here, 4F and 2F, as you can see that they're labeled there. What is this stuff? This is pumice. Pumice is essentially very, very finely ground volcanic rock. And we're going to use this to polish and grain fill our French polishing. Because French polishing isn't just about the surface being covered in a shiny layer of shellac. It's actually about the surface being perfectly flat so that a very thin layer of shellac can shine very clearly. The reason that there are two grades of pumice is the different coarseness. 2F is coarser than 4F. 2F also is a little bit bigger than 4F. So for the initial pour filling, I tend to prefer using 2F. 4F is great as you've begun to level out your board and want something a little bit finer. And these are the ones that we sell at Tools for Working Wood. And they've got these lovely little tops here. So you can pour out a large amount, or you can use the shaker top like that, which is what we'll be using to use it today. Now, if you're moving a lot of pumice around, it's going to make a lot of dust. You might want to wear a dust mask. For presentation's sake, I'm not going to throw one on, but normally if I'm handling it in any great quantities, I'll put on a dust mask. But once it's settled, you can leave it there and you can take your mask off. And I'll show you how we're going to use that in just a second. Now, this is a very long, drawn-out process. I'm not going to be able to show all of it, but I will be able to give you the basics on how to get started and hopefully give you the confidence to try French polish out yourself. I've got a nice prepped little board here. Now, this has some porousness to it, so we'll need some grain filling, which is why I picked it, so that we can show off a little bit of the pumice here. I've got another dish here. I'm just going to flip this upside down. I'm going to pour some of this pumice with a very convenient top in it. Just pour a little out like that. Now, before you put these down, one thing you really got to be careful of is if you leave the top open and you put it down, a bunch of pumice comes up into the air. So just shut it. Put it down gently so you don't get the big cloud. All right, so we've got the pumice laid out there. Let's talk about the shellac side of things. It's important to have all your supplies close by so you can do things as quickly and as effectively as possible. So this is an old shellac rag that I have. Now, as you'll notice, these pads are not made up of the same thing as the pad that we had before. Whereas this pad was just t-shirt material, these pads are linen. And the reason people like to use linen is that it has a slight abrasive quality to it. So it just helps with the rubbing out process on the surface. You can use a cotton t-shirt or a rag of that nature to do this, but I prefer the feel of linen. And really, it's up to you what's available to you. All right, so now I'm going to pack this with cotton wool. So I've just got these cotton pads, like the ones that you get for your face. I kind of like these just because they're easy to get the right amount. You know, if you buy a big bag of cotton wool, you kind of got to pick and peel, whereas these, you know, obviously they just sort of come apart. You don't need a huge amount, small stack like that. We'll just build our little pad here, and essentially you just kind of want to get everything behind it so you can twist a little tail on it. So it's just like that. Twist it up on it like that. You don't want to make it too big, and you really don't want to make it too small either. If you make it too small, it'll be very hard on your fingers when you're pushing down, because you will need to exert some force as you're applying the French polish. But if you just got something like that, that should be pretty good. So we've got one pad built. I'm going to leave these here because I'm going to need a second pad, because this pad I'm mostly going to use for the pumice. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a first layer of shellac on here with this pad. Because if we just added the pumice to the board, it may fill the grain, but it may not stay there as we applied more stuff. If we throw this on, essentially what we're doing is giving a bonding layer for the pumice to sit in. And when French polishing, it's probably more convenient to take things out of these jars and move them to little squirt bottles like this. In addition to this, I've got that little thing of alcohol that I was using before. This is going to be useful as well. Essentially, you could have the alcohol in another squirt bottle like this, whatever makes the most sense for you. I just happen to have a few of these lying around, so they're convenient for that. So, same with the brush. Now that I've made the pad, I'm just going to charge it with a little bit of alcohol. Just get a little in there. And before I forget, I'm actually going to put gloves on now. Now, you don't have to wear gloves. Obviously, we're working with things that are very natural here. The shellac being natural and the alcohol being natural because it's not denatured alcohol. It's just grain alcohol. But I like the gloves just because the shellac will get a lot of sticky stuff on your hand, particularly when you're French polishing with a pad like this. And I don't always like that. I don't like the yellowness that gets under my nails from that. So I'm just going to use this. And you'll notice I'll do this a lot. And that's really just to see how much liquid is coming off the pad. It's just tamping it just to make sure that there's liquid. And I can see on the back of my glove here exactly how much is coming off. So it's just a testing matter for me to see exactly what's happening every time I put the pad down. All right. So we got a good amount of alcohol in there. Gonna load up our wool pad here with a decent amount of shellac. Start with that and see what that does. Okay, that should be pretty wet. All right, and I'm just going to go in the direction of the grain here. There we go. So you've got the whole surface covered, as you can see here. Now, if you notice what I was doing with the pad, as I was going in the direction of the grain, this is a technique that's talked about a lot in French polishing, the landing technique. As I'm moving, my hand comes down, lands on the pad, pushes across, and then comes back up. Or in this case, I came up a little short, so like that. And essentially what you don't want to do is you don't want to stop in the middle somewhere and leave a bit of a mark. And it doesn't matter, you don't have to go all the way to the end. You just don't want to move the pad and stop just like I did there. And you can see, just by doing that, there's one spot right there that has a particular sort of like dab on it. And that's exactly what you want to avoid. So just work that out. And keep going. I'm going to add a little more alcohol to this pad. Now, when you're adding alcohol, you can actually add it just to the pad. You don't need to open it up. But every time you add the shellac, you should open it up and add it to the inside of the pad itself. So just a little bit of alcohol to it. Make sure that we're cutting the shellac that's in there. Tamp it. Yeah, we're pretty wet. Then now, you can either put the pumice directly on the surface, Or you can dip the pad in the pumice just like that. Or put a little on your finger and then dip it. And now what we're going to do is we're going to work this pumice into the grain. This is where you're going to begin to have to work a little bit harder. So at the beginning, there's a lot of liquid on the pad. So you can work in larger motions. As that liquid goes away, the motions will have to get tighter as things get a little stickier. Now, in terms of patterns on this board, I like to make sure that I'm always doing roughly a grid. So I'm covering every spot methodically. And as you can see, this board wants to move around on me. But there, we've covered most of the board with that. And as you can see, it's dried very quickly because we added quite a bit of alcohol to our pad. And the alcohol is what's making this flash off very quick. So now, I'm just going to look at the board and see what's happening as I do those landing strips again. And we're going to have to keep working this until all the pores are filled. What we're actually doing is the pumice is abrading the surface. That surface is breaking apart and filling its own grain along with the pumice. One of the reasons I like to use 2F for this is that it goes a little faster than the 4F, being so much finer. So as we build this surface, we're also going to tear apart our pad. And that's just something that's going to happen, and you're going to have to replace it. Not a huge deal. Don't worry about it too much. Some people like to add oil for lubrication, but oils can introduce other problems, so I tend to stay away from them. But know that if you're having problems with the pad sticking a lot, you can add just a dab of olive oil or something like a non-drying oil just to lubricate things up. Try to use it sparingly though. Obviously, this dries very fast. Roughly the time it takes to get from one end to the other end of a 2 square foot board is roughly about the time it takes for the shellac to really begin to dry out. Now this is a lot smaller than that, so I can take some time in between every pass that I do on things, just to make sure that everything's fully dried before I begin to attack it again with the pad. Now, what we're really doing here is we're making the surface as consistent as possible, and you can begin to see that there's some places that are becoming very smooth, relatively speaking. It's a little hard to see on camera, but there are some spots that have a little more shine to them than other spots. And those are the spots where the grain is beginning to get filled and the surface is beginning to get uniform. And that's what we're working for. We're working to create a uniform surface because that is the secret behind true gloss, is uniformity. You know, when there's no angles to diffract light in a different way and to change what's reflecting, then you're going to get that real clarity and you're going to get that real gloss out of it. So we're spending a lot of the time up front right now doing this grain filling, which on tighter grain woods you don't really need to do. And in fact, actually on some tighter grain woods, you don't really need to use the pumice either. You can go straight to just shellacking and beginning to do some of these hand motions that I've been doing. All right, and that's got it. And we're getting a nice consistent reflection across the top, which is really what I'm looking for. So now we can move on from the 2F to a new pad. And at this point, I'm less concerned with just filling the grain and more concerned with actually beginning to polish this board, which is where the 4F really comes into its own. Now, you can also do what I call an English polish, or a British polish, I think some people call it. And that's essentially not using pumice as the abrasive, but doing a coat, letting it dry, and coming back with some incredibly fine sandpaper or a synthetic abrasive like a Norton Beartex, creating just a little bit of haze and dust on the surface. And then, when you come back to polish, you don't wipe that dust off, you polish that dust into the surface. And that mixture of shellac and wood becomes your grain filler. Not dissimilar from what you're actually doing with the pumice, you're just not needing to have the pumice. The big difference with this is that it is much more time consuming. Having the pumice as a third medium to fill that grain just helps speed this process up, which is already a very long process. So don't be afraid to pick up a couple of cans of pumice. So right now, I'm about to polish with 4F. I'm just going to give this a little bit of shellac, a tiny amount. We don't need a lot. And the rest can be done with the alcohol. All right, tighten our rag up. Just check it against our hand that it's putting just a little bit of a wet spot there. One of the reasons I like using gloves is that doesn't then get on my hands. I've got my little tray with a little bit of 4F on it. I'm just going to dab a little on there. And then you can start in circles. Now that I've sort of covered the whole board with that, then I can move on to longer strokes. Small boards like this, you have to use some of these long strokes. This is kind of a figure eight. It's almost like an S that I'm making across the whole thing. Again, I'm following the grid in my mind. I've made a grid on the board and I'm just trying to hit the whole grid evenly every single time. Now I've just been charging this pad with little bits of alcohol because the amount of shellac that I put in here to begin with, which is 1 or 2 squirts out of the bottle, should be enough to do the rest of the surface. The alcohol is just consistently thinning that out and allowing tiny amounts of shellac to get on that surface, which is what helps build a very, very thin clear coat. Again, focusing on the grid as you're doing this. You want to hit every part evenly, even if there's some part that you're looking at and it's like, why isn't that part getting hit? Don't focus on it. Just keep moving across the board evenly. And that's pretty good. Got a nice layer of shellac everywhere here. As I lean it forward here, you see that reflection of the table and the board. That's really what we're looking for there. All right, so now that we've got that done, we're gonna move to spiriting off. So I've just got a fresh pad here. Now the reason I've got this fresh pad is that it doesn't have any pumice on it. Both of these pads have 2 different grades of pumice on them. And now we're not worried about the actual polishing. We have a very shiny, grain-filled surface. This is just a pad that I'm gonna load up with a little bit of alcohol. Not a lot, just a tiny amount. Just enough to soak into the pad, just like that. Check the spot, just a little bit of a wet spot. And that's all you need. You don't need much. This is just gonna take some of that marking out. Now it's gonna start off pretty smooth. And as that alcohol evaporates, it'll feel a little stickier. And I like to do this little shoe shine motion here to really help sort of clean things up. And there we go. A perfectly glossy surface, as you can see. For example, this right here, you can see that is nicely reflected in that panel. And that's what we're going for. Nice, even reflections, not a bunch of distortion there. Gorgeous looking panel. So there you go. That's a basic introduction into the world of French polish. There's certainly a lot more to it than what I gave you right there, and I hope it gives you the confidence to pick some up yourself and try it yourself. Not just the French polishing, but brushing on shellac and using shellac with a rag, using shellac for the many different things that it's really well known for. Thanks again for watching, everyone. I'm Eddie O'Donnell. I'll see you in the next video.